With me now from the Heritage Foundation, Hans von Spakovsky. Hans, good to see you again.
Hi, Liz.
All right, Hans, last week we talked about the problems, the obvious vulnerability. I believe it was Twitter that had posted a quote-unquote fact check saying there were no vulnerabilities to fraud. There was no proof of widespread voter fraud with mail-in voting. So we debunked that in the first part of this discussion. The second part is the solution. In order to create a solution, you have to identify the problems. So what's the solution to this so that people who aren't comfortable going to the polls don't have to, but the rest of us feel secure knowing that our elections still have integrity?
Well, one thing first, and that is people who say they don't feel safe in going to the polls, are they going to the grocery store? Are they going to the pharmacy? Are they going to retail establishments? Because if they're doing that, they clearly can go vote. And in fact, the security health protocols there will probably be better than the retail establishments. But look, if people are voting through the absentee balloting process, what you don't want to do is override the security protocols that are in place over that. And that's what liberals are trying to do right now, particularly through lawsuits they filed. For example, they're trying to say there should be no witness signature requirements for those kind of ballots. They're saying that the envelopes that are sent to individuals to mail their ballots back should be postmarked by election officials. Well, if they do that, well, then when folks put their ballot in the mail in a pre-marked envelope, the Postal Service isn't going to postmark it again. So the post office won't, election officials won't know if that ballot was actually mailed after the election or before the election. So in essence, we should not override all the current security protocols in place, but that's what liberals are trying to do. At the same time, they're pushing all mail elections.
Which was, of course, why, and I said this a moment ago, this is, of course, why they're trying to shift the narrative to pretend that the president literally meant that he wants to delay the elections unilaterally. They don't want to have this discussion because they don't want people to know that not only are they proposing something that's very risky, that's vulnerable to fraud, they also want to override all the protections. The rational thing to do for people on both sides of the aisle is to come together, have the discussion, and figure out how to make this work. For example, Hans, the president tweeted this morning that the state of Florida has the proper protections that make him feel comfortable with mail-in voting. What does Florida do specifically that other states don't?
Well, for example, and this is probably the biggest issue in what's going on is, not only do they do signature comparisons to try to make sure that it's the actual voter, but you have to request an absentee ballot. You have to sign a form saying you want an absentee ballot. That gives election officials an opportunity to try to authenticate the request. What folks on the left are pushing for is simply to mail an absentee ballot out to every single person on the registered voter list. Well, the problem with that is, as you know, Liz, is voter lists are in terrible shape all over the country. And that would mean that you would have problems like happened in Nevada, where apparently thousands of ballots were showing up all over the state in bundles for people who didn't actually live anymore at their registered addresses, giving folks the opportunity, especially vote harvesters, to go around trying to collect those ballots and to try to vote them.
And I want to make sure that everyone understands what vote harvesting or ballot piracy, it's sort of three different names for the same activity, what it is. In some states, it's legal, like in the state of California. In some states, like North Carolina, it's illegal. It means that any person, it doesn't have to be a relative or a family member or anybody, any third-party individual can offer to take your mail-in ballot from your home and drop it off at your polling place. I don't even need to explain the opportunity for vulnerability for fraud there because there's no oversight between the time that the voter hands that third party the ballot and what happens to that ballot before it's delivered to the polling place. There's absolutely no way to know. In fact, the vulnerability for fraud is even higher in that situation because the signature of the voter is the legitimate signature of the voter, but the vote itself could be changed or could be done. Something could be done to it that was fraudulent. And I believe that we saw that happen with a mailman in New Jersey.
Well, yeah, we definitely saw it in North Carolina. The North Carolina race that you mentioned, in fact, the evidence showed that the vote harvesters would pick up ballots that had been signed by voters, but in some cases not filled out, and they would fill them out, not the voter. And in other cases, they apparently altered the choices made by the voter. So we definitely have seen that just 2 years ago in a case in North Carolina where the election was overturned because of that kind of absentee ballot fraud.
Which, and that's the other part of this. So people, I think, need to understand that the margin of victory extends not just for the presidential election, but all the way up and down ballot in local elections, state level elections, congressional elections, Senate elections. And the margin of victory in some of these cases isn't tens of thousands or 50,000 votes even. It can be as small as dozens of votes, 50 votes, 100 votes, which means that any tampering, no matter how few it might seem, even if it's not the mainstream media's definition of widespread, could alter the course, the outcome, the result of that election.
No, that's right. And remember, the rejection rate for absentee ballots by election officials is much higher than when people go to the polling place to vote.
Right, it is. All right, so the final thing is the definitive results issue. This was actually one of the reasons our founding fathers set up the Electoral College, is because they wanted to ensure that people were confident in the outcome of our presidential elections, that it wasn't recount after recount, that people didn't wonder if one place had done it correctly, if ballots had been tampered with, et cetera, et cetera. If we move to universal mail-in voting and we aren't confident that we're having signature checks and signature verifications, how do we ensure definitive results in a reasonable amount of time after voting day?
Well, I don't think you can do it. And the New York primary, it was June 23rd. It's taken them 6 weeks to try to count the ballots because they had a huge increase. Imagine that happening all over the country. It's very possible we could get to January 20th, Inauguration Day, and still not know who's been elected president.
And I challenge any and all liberals listening to this show to point out exactly what facts that we're discussing that are quote-unquote bald-faced lies, in the words of Joe Biden. Republicans are here to have the discussion. We want to make voting easy on people, and we want to protect the integrity of our vote. This should be something that isn't partisan. This should not be an argument. The fact that it is an argument points to the fact that Democrats are driven by their ideology. They don't care about these issues. But any number of these examples that we've given show us where the falsehood is. We'll correct it, except that it's not a falsehood, or else come and have this discussion with us and show us that you actually are well-meaning and have good motives. Hans, thanks for coming on the show.